When I was a kid, I used to hate going to school, and I used to wait for vacations to begin. For me, vacation time used to be the best time of the year. This was primarily because there were so many games to look up to, and my parents never put many restrictions on me and my brothers, as long as we didn't bother them or anyone else in the neighborhood. This was the same with my friends who lived nearby. And trust me, we knew this for good, hence we never bothered them and kept the fun to ourselves. The best thing about our group of friends was that each one of us belonged to the same age group, except my two elder brothers. But although they were the odd ones out, they equally enjoyed coming up with games and taking part in them. They were like our leaders. We would always circle around them with numerous suggestions, and they would, like the true veterans they were, choose the ones that sounded the best at that moment. Our little brains could think of thousands of games, only to be improved by their elite minds. Maybe we were not that good at coming up with games, or those ideas sounded only good in our heads. But sometimes I think that's what life is all about. There is nothing good enough until you make it. So one fine day, somebody had a crazy idea. As far as I remember, I think it was one of my brothers who suggested and said that we should head to the nearby graveyard. It did sound extremely scary to my little head, but we all gave in to its sheer ring. Being naive kids who were seeking some thrill, we all agreed willingly. And so we headed in all our mightiness to see what the cemetery had in store for us. We got there and realized that we did not have anything specific to do there. I mean, there was no room or tree that hosted a spirit or a grave that went missing. So we got there and we began playing our usual games like hide and seek, soiling ourselves in dirt profusely, oblivious to our surroundings, without giving a second thought to the place we were in. Apart from the gravestones scattered all across the place, it all seemed like a motherly innate playground to us. We ran around, our laughter filling up the air around the place, as we hid behind the graves or the bushes around them. As we played on for hours, the sun slowly started to set. It started becoming a tad dimmer as dusk almost settled in. We were still playing, oblivious to the darkness gradually seeping in. I found myself in a good hiding spot behind a big rock. As our seeker counted numbers loudly, each one of us giggled with a shushing finger to their lips. Suddenly, my eyes fell on something that intrigued me almost at once. I screamed at the top of my voice. "Come here! Everybody! I can see a hand here!" Our playful trance was broken at once by my sudden appeal. Everybody rushed over to see the matter at hand, which was a hand nevertheless. When I pointed them towards a manly hand that seemed to have emerged from nowhere, everybody circled around it to check out the stranger that grew like a sapling from the ground. It literally looked like a plant coming out from the ground. It was muddy and frozen still. We were very young to understand the gravity of the situation. We did not realize that it was perhaps something so huge, so it didn't bother us to go looking for our parents. Also, it would have spoiled the fun. So, we sat around, touching it and poking it, to see if it moved at all. One of my elder brothers, the funnier one, messed around with it a lot. He asked stuff like how many sugar cubes would he like in the tea, and then poured him down some imaginary tea in a clay cup. And he jokingly told us to drop 5 stones in his cup. We laughed as it all happened. He touched and prodded with the cup to those creepy fingers, and then stopped for a moment. Then he even shook that dead man's hand once. He greeted him and said that it was nice to meet him. And just when he did that, almost immediately the hand sprang up alive and grabbed my brother's hand. Scared as hell, my brother tried to get rid of it, pulling himself away from the tight grip. But the grip was too damn tight for a kid to let loose of. He was failing to dislodge those rough fingers off him all by himself. So despite feeling the stark horror of it all, with that dead hand grasping our hero, we pitched in to help. He screamed in pain. The grip seemed strong. All of us tugged at him with full force. But the hand wouldn't leave the clench at all. There was so much commotion in those moments that no one could think straight. We began shouting for help. And that's when an engine roared on the nearby road. It was a car with its headlights on. Maybe it was because of that noise, or the direct light that fell upon it, that the hand finally let go. Just as it did, we ran with all our might back to our houses. We weren't so far, maybe a mile away from our homes. Despite being tired after a long day of playing, we ran nonstop until we got home. We were convinced that it was a ghost and couldn't have possibly waited to breathe or look back for the fear of it following us. When we reached home, we narrated the whole story to our mother, who seemed surprised too. But she resented the fact that we ventured there on our own. We felt that her anger was justified, as we were asked plenty of times not to go near the cemetery. But we were rebellious kids wanting some adventure. My grandmother would often tell us that the place was haunted by witches. I always imagined what a witch looked like. Often during the dead of the night, when I would have a hard time sleeping, I would hear drums beating somewhere in the distance, and I used to connect it to witches doing their black magic stuff. I often heard anklets too, which made me very nervous. In our little town, people used to have plenty of short, scary tales to share. And now, we had our very own horror story. Although this short, scary incident was a unique one, unlike the woman in white or spotting a skinwalker in the woods, I still feel that there could be some theories that could explain the hand sprouting from the ground. But nobody investigated it back then, and so it has ended up becoming a short, scary story and nothing else. I think the townsfolk were too scared to even go near that place, let alone investigate such an encounter. The one theory I could think of is that it could be a case of a fresh cadaver. The fact that neurons are still firing up even after the body is dead could prove what we saw that evening. However, it seems a bit too far-fetched given the amount of time we spent playing on the premises. Another theory for this short, scary encounter is black magic, which sadly I don't really believe in. So I'm leaving this horror encounter of mine for you to opine upon. Type your theory in the comments while I start reading the next one. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I remember vividly that I had started to shake and quiver with fear. As soon as I arrived at the cemetery, I knew something was wrong over there. I stood there, staring in shock as I thought to myself as to what could have ever happened to this once beautiful and peaceful cemetery. My brother and I were visiting our late mother, who had passed away almost 8 months ago. It was pouring all day with heavy rains, and my sweater didn't exactly keep the warmth in my exhausted and frail body. I curled my fingers up and pulled down my ragged sleeves to cover up all of my exposed skin. I walked over to the grave of my mother and glanced at the small, glary image of my mom. All of my memories from my past flashed before my teary eyes. I kneeled down and placed her favorite roses in a plastic vase and generously slid it into the water. I then whispered quietly, "I'll see you next week, Mom." And I discreetly blew a kiss. My older brother and I slowly started to drag ourselves back to our pretty rundown car. I leaped over the tombstones one after the other, trying my best not to disturb the people resting beneath me. When I reached the gravel footpath, I grabbed hold of the door handle and sat on the tattered leather chair. It's so cold in this car, I felt like rolling up into a ball and shutting off from all of my surroundings. As I closed my eyes, I could taste the thick acid of this morning's breakfast beginning to rise up to the back of my throat. I felt cold sweat dripping down from my forehead as my body shook vigorously. I heard my teeth chattering in time with my body's sudden strong shake. I could smell the pollution that the car was producing as the engine slowly warmed up. But my eyes could see nothing but just pitch darkness roaming around. No light or excitement whatsoever. Quite hesitantly, I slowly opened my eyes, as if I had been asleep for over 100 years. I turned my head to the right facing Brian, but to my surprise, Brian was not there. Now that was surprising to me. I mean, where could he have gone? I began to ask myself numerous amount of questions, until I realized that there was no point in sitting here and doing nothing but waiting for him to arrive. I decided to walk out of the car and search for Brian. Despite the extremely cold weather, I determinedly jumped out of the car and began to look for my brother. I assumed he would be somewhere around the car. I mean, as it is, this place was somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I yelled out his name a couple of times, but to no avail. I rotated around searching everywhere, but I could not spot him anywhere. But then I caught a glimpse of a large shadowy figure lurking over my mom's grave, who I thought was Brian. But again, to my surprise, it wasn't him. The shadow caught sight of me as it turned, and it began to hover towards me, getting faster and faster. I was shivering with fear, my legs were paralyzed, and I wasn't able to run for my life like in those horror movies. And as the shadow reached me, I felt at home. I did not feel like I was being attacked anymore. I just let it surround me and caress me. And as I was lost in this emotion, I suddenly heard my brother call out my name. I opened my eyes to see him seated next to me. He was driving the car. Before I could say anything, he told me that I was asleep as soon as I got in the car. So whatever I saw and felt was a dream. But somewhere deep inside, I know for sure that it was more than a dream. It was my mother hugging me. I grew up in the southern part of Ohio. Growing up there, I was aware that out in the countryside, pretty close to the town of Chillicothe, there is an old unmarked cemetery where Elizabeth's grave is supposedly located. I still remember that we used to go out there when we were in high school because there wasn't really a lot going on after 8 p.m. in the town, especially for people under 21. The story goes that a young lady named Elizabeth, whose surname is unknown, committed suicide by hanging herself from a tree at the back of the cemetery. Her grave was there but apparently has been vandalized since, and no one knows where she is actually buried. Dozens of people that I know have visited this grave and all have similar stories. One particular occasion, I went there with my best friend and 2 of our guy friends. I was home from college for the summer, and we were extremely bored. One of us got the bright idea to drive up to Elizabeth's grave, and we all agreed it could be fun. We didn't really expect anything to happen. For the sake of the story, we'll call my best friend Anna and our 2 guy friends Peter and Chris. We drove out in Chris's car at probably 10 p.m. at night. Luckily, there was no one there with us while we were there. Most of the time, one would run into others since the area is well known for ghost hunting. We didn't really explore much. We just all walked back to the tree and sat in a circle in the grass. It was dark but clear, so we could still see really well from the moon and stars. We sat for a while and just listened. Nothing significant was really happening at all, so we started asking for anything that was there to give us a sign. But again, nothing happened. We started having a random unrelated conversation until Chris got up and said,
"Who wants to go into the woods with me?"
The property sits in a clearing completely surrounded by woods at the back. At that time, I had a crush on Chris and wanted to seem cool, so I volunteered, while Anna and Peter hung back by the tree. I followed him in, moving at a slow pace and pausing at intervals to listen for animals or other unusual noises. By the time we had gotten far enough in for Anna and Peter to disappear, I started feeling really uneasy. I told Chris to stop walking, and when he asked why, I told him I just didn't think he should go too far. I could still hear Peter and Anna talking in the distance, and they were checking on us every so often by yelling out to us. We stopped for a moment, and all you could hear was our breathing. Suddenly, from what sounded like it was about 15 feet from us, we heard 3 distinct knocks. It sounded exactly how a knock on a door would sound, but I doubt if there were any doors in the middle of the woods. Knocking on a tree trunk wouldn't have made a similar sound. I heard Anna yell, "Very funny, guys. We know that was you." Chris and I looked at each other and made our way out of the woods. When we got to the clearing, Anna and Peter were casually laughing but quickly stopped when they saw how serious we were. We decided we wanted to get the hell out of there. We entertained the idea that it could have been someone in the woods trying to scare us, but there were no other cars at Elizabeth's grave except for ours. It's on a 1-lane dirt road surrounded by fields on one side and deep woods on the other. We would have seen another car pull up if it ever arrived. An animal definitely wouldn't make 3 distinct, measured knocks. And no, it wasn't a woodpecker either, the sound was totally different. We all piled up in Chris's car, and as he was sitting in the driver's seat, he sighs and slowly says,
"Guys, I think I don't have my keys."
We were certain he was playing a joke on us, but he shook his head, and we knew that he was being serious. We all got out again, freaked out, and started looking around with our phone flashlights for his missing keys. We looked where we had been sitting, and also near the woods. I definitely did not want to go back into the woods again. Peter yelled over from the left side of the property that he had found them. It was in an area that none of us had bothered to even go close to. We had no idea when he may have dropped them, if he ever did. The placement didn't make any sense. He could have very well been playing a prank on us, but I have no idea when he put the keys over there or when he would have had time to. I was with him the entire time. Anna assured me that Peter didn't go over there while she was with him, and Chris and I were in the woods. We got back into the car, scared that it might not start, but it started up fine. Others who have visited have said, at times their car wouldn't start when they tried to leave. As we were driving away, the windows fogged up and we could see what looked like a set of 3 fingerprints had made swiping marks along the windows of the car. They were on almost every window, and none of us had put them there. I haven't been back since. That was in 2007. I'm certain the place is still frequented by the town's teenagers, but it's worth a trip as long as you manage to return home safely. I remember listening to some of the older folks talk about their friends who went exploring the cemetery but never returned. Also, they spoke of certain warnings that the spirit always gave the visitors. And knocking was one of them. I am more than happy that none of us decided to hang out there any longer, just to be regarded as a daredevil. I worked at the cemetery for almost 2 years. One fine afternoon, my coworker and I were walking the paved roads there with a trash bag, picking up litter. We came upon a particular area of the cemetery that has a lot of mausoleums, and took the next lane around a corner that goes along the side of one mausoleum. As we walked around it, there was an older gentleman standing there with his back against the side of the mausoleum, just looking at a plot of graves nearby. 2 things were kind of weird about him. He was dressed a bit odd. His clothes were a little out of date. But it didn't bother me much, since a lot of elderly people dress in out-of-date clothing anyway. So I shrugged that off. The second thing that I noticed was that he had a coffee mug that he was drinking out of. It was not a thermos, but an actual ceramic coffee mug that he was sipping out of, that too right in the middle of the cemetery. He noticed us walking across. We waved to each other and kept walking. We were only a few feet away when my coworker said that that was a little weird. We both looked over our shoulders back at him, but he was gone by then. We stopped and kind of took a few steps back to see if he'd walked around the mausoleum or something, but we couldn't see him anymore. He was gone. A couple of days later, we both showed up for work and found one of the old-time workers to let him know we were there. We talked to him for a few minutes, and I brought up seeing the old man by the mausoleum in the west section. The groundskeeper smiled and asked,
Did he have a coffee mug?
We nodded, and he said,
Yeah, that's a spirit. He's not really there.
We pressed for more explanation, and he said that he has always been seen in that spot, looking at a family plot, and always has a coffee mug in his hand. He said there is a grave for his wife, 2 daughters, and himself. The husband's grave stated that he died in the early 1980s, while the others died a few decades earlier, and the 3 of them have the exact same date of death. The cemetery workers believe that he was the dad, and that he may be used to visit his wife and daughter's graves a lot. He told us that people generally see him for a few seconds, and then he's gone. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. Now that you have made it till here, I want you to choose the topic for the next video. Comment down below and let me know your favorite topics for a horror podcast. Also, I'd love it if you could bring more horror story lovers to our Mr. Scares horror community.